Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the School of Innovation podcast. I'm your host Yaniv, and today I'm super excited because we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. We're going to talk about how to find success with startup experiments, so running POCs or proof of concepts and that sort of stuff. With me are two incredible people. Literally incredible people. Jenny Wu and Roland Osborne from 500 Startups. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having
us. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Good to have you. Good to have you back in school. I thought we would kick things off with a quick intro, and maybe Jenny, you want to start us off? Tell us a little bit about 500 and yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So 500 Startups, as most people know us, is a startup accelerator that's been out here in the Valley for over a decade. So we're now on over 35 batches of seed stage founders who we run through a program that helps them achieve growth in a certain number of months. And we're also a very active global VC firm. But apart from those activities with early stage founders, we also work with a number of other players in the global startup ecosystem, such as corporates, nonprofits, governments who are looking for innovation or growth in various ways. And so that's where Roland and I sit within the larger firm. So we do a lot of work that facilitates the relationship between startups and corporates. So in my role, as a director in the corporate growth team, I work with a lot of leaders at these large companies to try to figure out how a global VC network and our portfolio companies and our expertise could be beneficial to these large corporates. So that could be anything from introductions to startups to longer, more involved projects that really help them, with their innovation activities. So that's a bit about me. And prior to 500, I worked in innovation consulting, so helping bring new products to market and also helping clients set up their innovation labs or their teams.
Nice. Cool. Roland, want to take it away, man?
I will take it away.
Thank you.
So my name's Roland Osborne. I currently serve as director of the corporate experimentation practice at 500 Startups, which means I am thinking critically about how corporations are approaching this whole problem of experimentation and innovation, looking kind of across the programs we're doing, helping startups work with corporates in the service of experimentation and innovation, and helping corporates better interface with startups to achieve some of their business goals.
Nice.
Previously at 500, I ran 500's mobility practice, both investing in and managing proof of concepts with corporate partners. And prior to 500, I've been an operator, so I came from the startup world. I've founded 3 companies. The last was in the customer service space. I did that for 10 years as a head of product. And I've also worked at accelerators in Eastern Europe and South America before 500, as well as went through an accelerator myself with my last company. So I've kind of seen, a bunch of angles to this, I guess.
You had skin in the game.
You had skin in the game.
Well, you still have skin in the game.
I lost some skin.
You lost some skin
at various points, but I still have skin in the game. I've still got some shares and stuff that are floating around. I mean,
that's awesome. That's awesome. And I love the way that you guys complement each other, like your backgrounds and your skill sets kind of complement the sort of the high level strategic thinking, but also like low level, more like down in the trenches kind of approach. So that's pretty cool. And hoping we can kind of have that, that kind of take from both of you as we talk about how to run POCs. I want to stress out something that you said, Jenny, about the fact that 500 Startups has a corporate innovation team. And that's kind of like, for those listening, it's kind of an unusual situation for a VC to have a corporate innovation team. Just wondering, why? Can you like say a few words about what was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, so 500 Startups, we have a mission of uplifting people and economies through entrepreneurship. And so a big part of that is serving the founder community, as we've done for many years. But I think we also, believe that one of the most influential, players in economies all around the world are often corporations. And corporations have a very substantial impact on innovation, and they have tremendous resources for this ecosystem. And so we think there's a lot of room for them to be, investors, sponsors, customers, acquirers of startups, including our own. So I think 500 and the people of our team, who often span both kind of ex-founders and also sort of ex-consultants, we are that middleman, that facilitator of these worlds. And this team is still, I would say, compared to the rest of the firm, a bit newer, and still really trying to think about how do we best deliver value to all these parties. But so far, it's been an interesting ride to figure out how we can best service these corporates who are often very used to working with consulting firms. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, they have a very transactional relationship with certain VCs in this ecosystem. And right now we are kind of somewhere in between, around we want to definitely service our founders well. We have a founder-friendly kind of facet in our DNA as 500 Startups. But we also know that, corporates are a different audience than startup founders. And so our team needs to be very have that in mind and be cognizant of what, C-suite Fortune 500 audiences need. And so that's always an interesting dance sometimes. And I think a pair like myself and Roland have been interesting as we think about how to staff up our teams of people who understand the corporate politics and all of the bureaucracy that can be involved in getting any sort of project through a large organization. But then paired with someone who has tried to do a company themselves, gone through the ups and downs, and are therefore trusted by some of these C-suite audiences as okay, you understand how it's done. You're not just someone who's here to kind of deliver a presentation.
Yeah. That's amazing. Again, that sort of duality between, two sort of opposing, sometimes I guess opposing points of view. And I think I have more respect for you now than I did when we started this conversation, because your job is super hard. You gotta sort of wear the suit and wear the hoodie at the same time and kind of speak both languages and still make everyone happy. So that's really difficult. So awesome. We're going to talk about something very specific today to kind of structure this conversation, which is a report that you guys wrote, which is called Startup Corporate Experiments, Finding Success with Proof of Concepts. And maybe, obviously, we're going to link to the report at the end and in the show notes and everything. But for those folks who haven't read the reports, can you maybe, Jenny, give us a bit of context as to why you wrote the report, how you wrote the report, that sort of thing? Yeah.
Definitely. So awesome. I think there's a couple of drivers for why we decided to do this piece of research and write this paper. So I think from our team's perspective, we've definitely been seeing throughout the years that a lot of these corporate innovation teams and labs are moving away from kind of innovation just for show and that innovation theater to partnerships and programs and activities that are aiming to have more impact and outcomes. So maybe a couple years ago, we would often get a lot of requests for, just startup intros or give me kind of a tailored demo day with a lot of cool things. And I think as we've seen the trend shift a bit, now we see a lot more requests for, more tangible partnerships with these startups. Like, how do we experiment with their technologies? How do we set something up where it's not just, the demo day, but it goes farther than that? So that's a bit of what we've seen on our team. And we also at the same time.
What caused that? What caused that? What can you put a finger on why that happened? Why is it happening now? Is it COVID?
Yeah, I think a lot of these teams start out with a lot of excitement and momentum. And I think initially it's very hard to think about, what outcomes you might get after a year or two of opening up, your lab or your Silicon Valley outpost. And I think after, getting set up, these teams pretty quickly realize that it's hard to get actionable outcomes out of these teams. And they increasingly, after, let's say, a year of operation, are getting pressure from their executive sponsor, whoever has been backing their mandate, who are asking, hey, what's going on? Like, what do you have to show to the rest of the organization that is curious as to why we're spending so much money on this lab? So, I think it tends to be the natural trajectory for some of these teams after a year or two in operation to then turn, inwardly and be like, okay, how do we actually begin getting more hands-on with some of these potential partners?
Kind of a maturity curve, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think from the research standpoint, we found there is certainly a lot that's been written about innovation labs and, how to set them up and some of the really cool things that are happening. I think we found there was less written on the partnership and experimentation aspects. So once you're, truly have this engagement set up with a startup, how do you make sure that the founders, feel heard and their needs are met? How do you define the metrics and the experiment so that all parties agree on the outcome? Those really tactical bits. Our team found it hard to get some of that context as to what other people are doing. So we decided to, tap into our network, some of the people that Roland has worked with on experimental type of projects, just interview at least like a dozen of practitioners in this space, and just to figure out how's it going? Like, how are you setting up things? What is working for you? And synthesize some of those findings. And hopefully we can distribute those and share them amongst this community so that we're all a little bit more equipped to actually handle these types of activities.
Yeah, that's great. At least for me, as I was reading this, like my point of view as a reader, it was very easy to get into. Typically, like, you have to force yourself to read reports because you got to read them. But this one felt like, okay, this I can relate to this, and I also found it like, sometimes people equate like practical with like bad, or it's not like, not interesting. But I think practical is underrated, and it was very practical. It was very practical. So with that, maybe let's get into some of the practicalities of the report. And Roland, I'm going to turn it to you to talk a little bit about POCs, because we've been like throwing the word around.
Sure.
What are POCs besides a cool acronym?
POCs are it's infinitely confusing even within 500, because we previously used the term on the investment team as point of contact as well. So I'm just in this world where it's just POC this and that, and it means a million different things. So yes, it's probably smart to start by defining what we're talking about here. At its core, proof of concept, POC, proof of concept, as we're going to use it here, is an experiment to test a solution to a business problem or a business opportunity. Probably let's call it opportunity.
Yep.
Most folks, probably most of the audience, has heard POC use, again, still kind of under this definition, in the context of trying out a piece of software or a vendor solution, where you've got a sales team who's like, let's try before we buy, sort of thing. Yeah. That's how most of the world uses the term POC. And there's software built around this. There's a bunch of stuff. It's a valuable use case. It's something that needs to happen. But the subject of our paper is not as much about that kind of, we've got a very well-defined business opportunity or problem. We've got a vendor who's got a very well-defined, solution. Like, we're going to buy this software, we're going to buy this CRM thing, and we're going to see if it like plugs into our existing systems in the way we expect, and time box it. At 500 and kind of in the innovation sense, we look typically towards startups or something that is a little bit less defined at the beginning. So that business opportunity we're testing could be a new line of business that grows the top line. It could be a pain that might affect the bottom line, but as we're not quite sure exactly the shape that solution's going to take, or we're a little more open to that problem being redefined a little bit,
open-ended.
And so when I say yes, open-ended, but as we'll get into, the real key here is we are de-risking that open-endedness by breaking things into smaller chunks.
Yes.
But I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I don't know, does that make sense?
That makes
as a definition.
Yes.
So it's a test. It's simply a testing something to evaluate whether a specific business opportunity can be seized upon, whatever, solved.
Yeah. And I think so. It kind of in your minds complements or is another sort of tool in the war chest, or whatever you want, a toolbox, whatever you want to call it, of the corporate innovator, right? It's another way of like trying to figure, as you said, like kind of de-risking a certain opportunity, right?
Absolutely.
Just kind of curious about your thoughts on this. How does that compare or contrast with some other methodologies that corporate innovators might use? Would you say like going for a POC is, I don't know, like favorable attributes, quicker, faster, more comprehensive than maybe some of the other methodologies that we could use?
It depends on what your goals are, really, right? And so I think to the degree that you know what the solution looks like, you don't do a POC in the way we're going to be speaking about, right? Like you don't interface with the startup, right? There's always, in this kind of menu of options, right? You can kind of partner with startups in kind of the POC sense. You can partner and buy them. You can invest in them. You can build stuff yourself. Mm-hmm. You can acquire other companies that are already built, who've already figured this stuff out. And so there's a bunch of different things you can do. I think a problem that I see over and over with corporates who may kind of, if there is any hype into POCs, I don't think there really is, but there certainly is hype working with startups. they should not, they should kind of reevaluate whether they want to work with a startup if um, they really already know exactly what they want to build and they're not open to kind of redefining their core assumptions.
Okay.
If you know what you want to build, you have resources that there's very rarely kind of a technological magic or something that just comes from a startup and like you bring them in and they just get stuff done faster than your internal team. Startups get things done generally because they're scrappy and they tend to be ignoring some of the things, you know, that you as a corporate might be paying attention to, right? They're deliberately like not thinking about things either. Well, it may be deliberate, it might be because they're just you know scrappy and haven't thought about that, but they're pushing ahead anyway.
Ignorance is bliss, man. Ignorance is
bliss. And that's where a lot of the efficiency comes from.
Yes.
So
agreed. Okay, so I think
I would say,
go ahead.
So sometimes we talk with our partners on levers to consider, like right, speed and cost being pretty top of mind. I think learning is something too, like how much do you want your team and the rest of the organization to get out of this process? But as Roland mentioned, control over what happens from this engagement and to what extent you want to be sort of micromanaging every step and how it's done. I think that's a piece where, you know, we kind of definitely warn our partners, like the POC process, there's going to be a lot of give and take along the way because you have a founder with a pretty successful technology. And so I think if the corporate is really dead set on doing something a certain way, you know, the POC might not be the most
the best course of action. That founder is not your employee, right? So there's a negotiation sort of built into the process, I think. And what I kind of extract from what you guys said, where I was trying to get as like, you know, what's a good use case to run a POC and when should you not run a POC? And sort of what I've extracted from what you said as sort of a rule of thumb is if you want to, like, if the conversation matters to you, if you want to kind of, if you're in a more learning mindset, right? That's a good indication that you want to go for a POC because you get that, and I think it might be underscored, you get that built into the process. You get the learning of the culture, of the way of doing things, of all of that stuff. But if you don't value that, or you value efficiency over that, then you probably shouldn't run a POC. Does that make sense? Or did I just...
you really nailed it with that. I mean, another way I've thought about even defining a POC is a way to maximize organizational learning while minimizing the resources required. So that absolutely is another way to think about
this. That's even better. That's going in the show notes. That's even better. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you sell that idea, the POC, both because it's sort of a double-sided market, right? You got to sell it to the corporate, you got to sell it to the startup. How do you guys do it? How do you sell it? How do you convince them? How do you influence them? How do you make it happen?
So I could start with the corporate side. I think, you know, as I mentioned before, sometimes you get to the startup introduction and you can show to, you know, your sponsor, like, hey, I've gotten X number of intros this quarter, or we've come up with a couple of new ideas. But I think increasingly we're seeing the success metric move further downstream to, you know, what happens after that. So sometimes for the, you know, clients we work with, they're looking for you know, something that's a bit more experimental, and so we can, you know, through this POC process, help them come to something they can show back to their boss or their sponsor after, let's say, 6 months, and be like, here's something that we actually tested, and there's some sort of result that came out from it. Perhaps it doesn't indicate that there's a longer term successful partnership down the line, but it is a result that they could show back to their sponsor. So I think it's something a little bit more tangible that they can kind of show that we actually tried something very new that's been untested, and we tried it with an external partner. I think we often work with corporates who, what's the term? Like they get married to some sort of engagement, and it goes on for a very long time, and it ends up wasting a lot of time and resources. And some partners we talk about, they refer to them as like kind of zombie projects that are pretty much already dead, but there's someone who's very intent and has staked some of their reputation on making that project continue to happen. So another way we frame it as the benefit of POCs is you are able to avoid some of that longer term resource and time waste that could happen if you have a longer term. Yeah. So I think on the corporate side, there's a bit of you get some sort of outcome in a shorter time frame, and you get all of the benefits of collaborating with an actual startup. And so sometimes through kind of sort of osmosis, I guess, by working with these early stage founders, these teams get a lot of learning from that process.
Yeah, perfect.
Roland, and I'll let Roland talk about.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on the startup side. But yeah, I mean, I'll just say that what Jenny was just mentioning tends to be when kind of we get people coming to us, they've usually had some hard lessons on that side of the projects that have cost way too much and gone on way too long, right? Like those are people who are kind of begging for another way of doing things.
Yeah.
On the startup side, though, in some ways, it's an easy sell, especially to startups who are kind of less experienced. That's a good thing. It's also a very bad thing. And that's and as investors in startups, we have to be very careful with that, right? Like you can. Plenty of corporates are in this power position where they just the proposition of being able to work with a startup that is desperate for a first customer, desperate for a big logo, for a pitch deck or whatever, is going to say yes. And so on that side, it's very easy. The problem is a lot of them go down this path, like probably putting in all sorts of their own resources. And in startup world, every startup is kind of on the verge of death at any moment, and can't afford to keep kind of doing the de-risking process over months and then more months with a corporate. The opportunity of the cost of that at the very least just gets to be really huge. That is a problem. And it does kill many startups. We try to help kind of on the startup side, like hey, a POC is a way that you can get some of those answers about working with the corporate without risking your business in this big way. On the other hand, and I think this is something that on the corporate side, corporates need to be really, really cognizant of. Really good startups and seasoned founders don't fall for the hey, like I'm going to work with a corporate at all costs, or I'm just gonna join your corporate accelerator. I'm just going to do this POC because you are the company that everyone wants to work with. The really good companies have other avenues now and don't have to do that. And so on the corporate side, if you want to work with the really good founders, the ones who have truly redefined categories, turned the problems on their head, or doing really interesting things, you need to bring some other things to the table, right? And often looks like kind of it can be market access in certain ways. It can be even understanding industry standards is something that it's actually table stakes for corporates, and it's very easy. It seems like something that a corporate can offer. But if we're looking at automotive industries or fintech, a lot of the protocols that are behind things or standards are really hard for a startup to even know about. And so that's something a corporate can offer very practically to a startup that is hugely beneficial to them. And it's something that can kind of help them along outside of the prospect of doing business together.
Yeah, definitely. I think the learning goes both ways. And I'm curious, do you guys do any sort of I'd say setup or pre-processing work, or whatever you want to call it, before you make the engagement? Kind of like, I don't know, do you keep a reputation score on the different companies, like on the startups and on the company side, like which one has like good track records with these sort of engagements, or which one has like the right team in place, or like that kind of setup? Do you guys do that, or can you share some thoughts on that?
Jenny.
So I think when it comes to finding the right partners for some of our corporates, our team certainly has a methodology and a couple of specific criteria that is honed alongside the client partner, who often has some pre-existing requirements of their own. Sometimes they are looking for startups who have already gone through some sort of partnership already. So they don't want a first-time founder who's never worked at the corporate. So that is sometimes a requirement we get. On our end, for any startup we introduce to the corporate, folks like Roland might have to have some sessions with them to kind of prepare them to work with the corporate and set the right expectations. And this comes from everything from style and just like presentation, and also resources and getting them acquainted with the corporate timeline and speed of working versus perhaps what they're familiar with.
Now I'm curious, Roland. Give me a taste of what goes on in one of these conversations. Like, what do you say? How do you prepare? How do you prepare them? I'm like seeing you like in a sweaty room and like just kind of cheering and that sort of, like, what happens?
Let's see. I mean, well, normally this happens separately, right? So I'm talking to both the startups and the corporates, and not in the same room to prepare them for that.
Yes.
that first conversation. I mean, it comes down to reminding people about what's actually important and what's not. And so, we are in a POC, we are ultimately looking to validate whether whether the big opportunity exists, right? Whether we're going to 5x, this business opportunity, not whether, we comply with, their existing backend infrastructure and it like plugs in or something, or it definitely checks all the boxes that the legal team wants. And so on the corporate side, there's a lot of coaching because corporates that are very good at working within a framework and achieving a goal that is well defined, and that stuff doesn't matter as much early in a POC engagement. So I'm trying to kind of like, hey, like let's focus on the opportunity. Let's be curious. Let's not come in assuming we have all the answers. Let's not come in and try to show off our status as like, you know, an expert in X or Y field, which can happen, and I've seen happen and doesn't end well. And on the startup side, it's, I get, well, that's the thing is there's more coaching on the corporate side early in the engagement, and more coaching for the startups as we start to go through, right? Yeah. It's like that gulf of, I want the corporates to kind of meet the startups in startup land at the beginning. And as we move towards commercialization and that whole kind of arc, the startup needs to learn to, like, by the end of that journey, the startup needs to like fully understand all of the things the corporate is thinking about. Yeah. And so it's a little bit more skewed. I mean, obviously, you know, I try to have them not like say stuff that's going to offend people, you know, bring that same kind of curiosity to understand the problem, you know, from the corporate perspective, and ask questions. But yeah, it is a little bit more lift on the corporate side initially, and then it's this journey towards getting the startups into that, you know, like dotting all their I's, crossing their T's kind of situation, like over the engagement.
Nice. I like that. I like the metaphor. It's a growing process. It's beautiful. Yeah. So guys, are you ready to talk about about the key findings from the report? I feel like this is like something that we should get into, like the meat on the bone. Some of the key findings that you got from talking to these 12 stakeholders, and what did you find out? Jenny, do you wanna kick it off? Do you wanna share that with us?
Yeah, I'll talk a bit about some of the high level takeaways. I will say that, you know, we only interviewed, you know, a handful, just over a dozen. Okay. So I think some of these are obviously going to depend on your industry and the maturity of your innovation efforts. But I do think that these are pretty indicative, I would say, of a lot of the corporate partners we have worked with over our team's, you know, a couple of years of doing this type of work.
Okay, maybe let's not give them all of the key findings. Give them all but one. Okay.
Let's see. You know, I think one thing I thought was interesting that, you know, Roland and I were talking about after interviewing some of these folks was the preference to and comfort to work with startups that are a little bit later stage. So part of this is because when they're a bit later stage, they have some proven case studies and some proven traction that they're able to showcase to these corporates who are often pretty risk averse, and they need something that has worked well before to take a chance on it, even if it's in a POC type fashion, which, you know, is supposed to be pretty a bit of an experiment. But
people don't want to see the wires sticking out. That's the thing.
Yeah. So a lot of the respondents said, you know, they're looking for Series A, Series B. They want someone who has, you know, they literally say case studies. So that is something that is just hard to, I would say, pretty standard for our corporate partners. And I think along with that, you know, if you think about some of the innovation frameworks that we often hear about, like Horizon 1 to Horizon 3, we see startups being useful for a lot of different timeframes. You know, sometimes if you're really in a very exploratory mode, you can definitely engage with some startups and think about where their technology could take you in the future. But from a POC type standpoint, and to have I think really effective experimentation, we found that corporate teams are more comfortable with the shorter timeframes. So like thinking about like Horizon 1, like let's say like 1 to 3 years out, and some of the specific business needs or technology needs that they're seeing come from their organization. I think that tends to be a smoother match between startup and business unit. And it's a little bit easier for us to define the metrics for success and what they're looking for. Yeah. Whereas I think if it's a bit further out, like a Horizon 3, it's harder to think about like, what are we actually trying to get out of these 6 months of collaboration?
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. What else? Anything else that you found surprising?
Yeah, I think another somewhat, funny, I would say, takeaway is that pretty much everyone said they wanted to move faster than they are right now. Even I would say the more mature innovation teams that we've spoken to, who are able to execute, POCs under 6 months, sometimes even like 1 to 3 months. Everyone seems to think that they're moving slower than the industry is. Wow. Which also kind of points out, there's a real lack of, I would say, true benchmarks in innovation. It's hard to kind of go out and Google and think about, what is the standard length of time for a POC. So it seems like everyone thinks that they're falling behind when really they're actually, I think, doing okay.
Yeah. If they're thinking and doing POCs, they're definitely okay.
Yeah, they're ready. If you are thinking about experimenting with startups and keeping an open mind about it, you're already ahead of the curve when it comes to corporate innovation.
Absolutely. Okay. Anything else before we talk about kind of the challenges of running a POCs? Because it's not all rainbows and unicorns, right? Any other? Let's see.
Yeah, maybe I'll also point out, I would think a positive finding was that, measuring innovation has historically been really tough for these types of teams and for the whole industry. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. But what I thought was an optimistic finding was that most of the people we talked to did say that they look at metrics and with a portfolio lens. So not just volume of activity, which tends to be first and comes to mind, immediately around, how many startup intros, how many POCs, how many ideas are generated. I think we're beginning to see additional metrics that are more outcomes oriented or around, let's say, conversion. So how many of these intros actually converted to real projects or experiments, or maybe like how much of your spend on innovation actually converts to something new being, produced at the end of the funnel. So I think that's definitely an evolution that is still in progress. And measuring innovation continues to be a challenge on all of our projects, but I would say that is getting better, which is good.
No, it's great. It's a step in the right direction for sure. Like definitely. Okay, let's talk about the challenges of like what could actually go wrong and what should you think about if and when you want to run a POC. Roland, maybe you want to share a few of the hardships, the challenges, the stuff that didn't go well, or could not go, or doesn't go well.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the number one, I don't know what we put as number one in the paper here, but coming to my mind right now is not doing enough work with stakeholders in advance, either on making sure you're solving a figuring out a business opportunity that people care about. Like that's something that's often overlooked. If you've got an innovation team that's working in a silo and they're talking to startups, and like you may even do something that's kind of exciting, but if you haven't related it back to the business in a meaningful way, you can have something that it looks like a successful POC, everyone's excited, and then just like goes nowhere at the end. Which is exactly the kind of thing that like kills a startup who's put everything in, or is bad for innovation teams, who are starting to measure things, in the ways that Jenny was just talking about. I think also on that stakeholder side, there's also, besides just buy-in into business opportunities, there's buy-in into this innovation process itself, into how you do experimentation, how you run POCs, and buy-in into the goals, right? Buy into the fact that this is going to be measured perhaps on the, in part on rapid learning at low cost, rather than getting something forward at any cost, which is often, the default people fall into. So if you haven't got, as an innovation team, if you have not gotten proper buy-in into the process, you don't have permission to fail. You don't have the ability to cut things short when you know that there's no real path forward. Instead, you have to double down. That is, by far, like, kind of the biggest problem we see, like, kind of across everything.
I think on the corporate side, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a lot of, like, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but like political, conversations that you need to have, like the context you need to understand. You really need to understand the business and the business units and the motivations and the politics within them to kind of get your chips in line, or whatever the saying is, like, get right.
I mean, 100%.
Okay.
And so
not underestimating that, I think. Right?
No, yeah, absolutely not, right? And so the organizations, the corporates who do this really well generally have a fairly empowered innovation team, one that has executive sponsorship, where there is buy-in, the antithesis of what I just said, where there's buy-in from at the executive level, kind of supporting the innovation team, and some pressure perhaps from the executive level for business units to work with startups, right? Like, reframing it as I'm actually, speaking as the executive, like, I would be upset if you don't explore these opportunities right now, like, that's bad on you, rather than if you explore them and fail, like, that's your job. And that definitely does not exist everywhere, but the companies who have a consistent, like, massive successes in this space are the ones where an executive has been willing to expend some of their reputation and political capital to, like, get all those people, force business units into a room with an innovation team and say, like, you guys are doing something here. If you bow out, like, that's a problem. I'm fine, like, they're fine if it doesn't work out or if it doesn't make sense. But obviously, like, and I know there's probably people that'll be listening to this podcast, that, if you are on an innovation team without that support, it becomes hard, right? And in that case, I think that, that's personally why I doing a podcast like this, why we do outward facing stuff, because we think that needs to happen, and executives need to hear that, right? To empower innovation teams. You can do some of that from the inside, but some of that needs to come from the outside, from people who've seen it working. You're going to need to make that leap at some point.
You can bring them just so far, but they have to make they need to make the commitment and make the final kind of leap of faith.
Absolutely.
But you said something about consistency, which I thought was really interesting, and wanted to know, does that, what part that plays into the overall process of running POCs? Because obviously, like, yeah, you need to be consistent, like, full stop, right? If you want to be successful at anything. But do you find that the ones that don't have that consistency of like trying and again doing these kind of engagements, giving up after the first one, are the ones that kind of miss out, right, on on the value, the real value of running these POCs? So you got to be consistent in doing these engagements, even if the first one sucked or the second one sucked.
Yeah, you do. And I think we were running a this is another sort of project. We at 500 we actually do training for accelerator managers. So some of these are corporate accelerators, some are other investment firm accelerators. Since we have all this experience running all these programs, we actually do training there. I was running a session in that accelerator training and talked to a couple different corporate program managers, and found that ones that when they had corporate participants or mentors, you know, from within the corporation who are working with the startups, who kept coming back, who had failures, you know, maybe the startup they were paired with didn't go anywhere, but they come back, you know, as a mentor again. You know, companies who have that behavior, I think, like, that's almost a metric in itself. If you can look at that, you know, hey, I quote unquote failed in a certain way, and I've come back, is this really powerful indicator from a cultural standpoint that you've done enough things for your employees in your company that they're kind of tolerant of failure a little bit. It's a very positive sign, and something to kind of like look for, that I think is indicative of that learning mentality and the ability to be kind of consistent in trying and iterating these things.
Nice. I like that as an indicator. So listen, we talked about why you wrote the report. We talked about what is a POC. We talked about, you know, what are some of the highlights or takeaways or key learnings. Talked a little bit about challenges. Jenny, maybe you can finish us off with some best practices for running these POCs.
Yeah, so I'll give a bit of a snapshot here, some of the ones that we highlight in the report. But I would say, you know, as Roland mentioned, like not, you know, having the right stakeholders, including that executive buy-in from the beginning, is going to be detrimental to your POC efforts. So one theme, I would say, that came out of the recommendations part on 500 is really to think about, you know, finding ways to bring your executives together and determine the opportunity spaces up front. So, you know, where are the technology areas you're hoping to be disrupted? Are there ways, you know, this could be in like an annual roundtable, or it could be a quarterly exercise of some sort, but get these stakeholders to begin thinking about some of these topics, so that when you go out and work with the startups, you can be a little bit more targeted in your efforts and you're not wasting the startup's time either. I would say also, as part of that, to be able to provide visibility into the different stakeholders that will ultimately need to be involved. So sometimes what we see is that the innovation teams themselves, who are in charge of scouting for these technologies, they are a bit siloed in that approach, and they might find something really interesting, but it turns out that there's another division that has been working on something similar and who's going to be very against testing, you know, this technology. So to the extent you can showcase and begin socializing some of the efforts that you're engaging in at the beginning, so that you avoid some of these political issues that may arise later, I think that's also really helpful in the stakeholder engagement aspect of the POC process. So I would say stakeholders and executive buy-in are definitely really important in terms of best practices. And the most successful teams we've seen definitely have a strong champion that is really supportive of this way of thinking and this way of operating with the ecosystem. Another theme I would say is that relates to the success of the scoping part of the POCs is really thinking about what is the problem you're actually trying to solve and how unhappy are the existing team members with the current technology. So if they're by and large like pretty content with how things are, that could be a bit harder to sell in a new technology that's going to be kind of risky, cumbersome to test. But if you're looking at a business unit that is deeply unhappy with the current situation and they're just dealing with it, that's a space that could be really ripe for innovation and for startup technology to come in and really help smooth things out. So we often recommend to our client partners, if you're able to find some business units that are not deeply married to their existing provider, find places where their current technology is a real pain. That's a great way to look for places where POCs might be a bit more successful.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. Like keep your ears and eyes open for those people, complaining about some aspect of their business, and measuring the amount of pain that they're feeling right now, and be there with like an interesting solution of like, why don't we run a POC to figure out this thing? So it's a great piece of advice. Our time's almost up. Let's tell people where they can find more information about you guys, about 500 startups, and obviously the report. Where can they buy the report? Read the report. They can buy it if they want to.
The report is available
for
free. You can, I think definitely find it pretty easily online by just Googling 500 startups and corporate startup experiments. Roland and I can be found pretty easily online as well. So 500 startups, our team has our own site with some of the activities that we do in this area. So you can see the capabilities we help corporations out with. So it's everything from working with startups to helping set up these POCs. And you can also find some more information about our portfolio companies as well.
Nice. And I'm going to link all that information in the show notes and the YouTube videos and whatever goes out. So thanks for that. If I had a virtual hat, I would take it off to you both for doing all this amazing work and for being on the show today. Thank you so much, both of you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.